Joining me now is former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski. And Corey, let's start with this search for the VP. Yesterday, Donald Trump sits down with Indiana Governor Mike Pence, sits down with his wife Karen for more than an hour. And we have CNN's Jamie Gangel reporting that there has been this ongoing push by Trump's kids and other senior members of the campaign lobbying for this VP candidate who would appeal to the GOP establishment. What do you think Pence's chances are here?
Well, I think the vice presidential selection is going to come down to one person's comfort level, and that's going to be Donald Trump. But I do think when you look at Governor Pence, he's the type of person that can help unite the party. Obviously, as you mentioned, he has a number of years of Washington, D.C. experience. He was a part of the leadership there. He's gone back now and served as a chief executive of a very important state, a state that Donald Trump is going to need to win in order to be successful in this election. He's got great relationships with other Republican governors, and he's the type of person that would bring a lot to the ticket. So, you know, as you look at Governor Pence, it's really going to come down to the personal relationship that he and Mr. Trump could have to find out if they can work well together. And if so, if that's Mr. Trump's choice, I think Governor Pence would be a great choice for vice president.
We learned this week that he is also vetting New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, as well as former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. But listen to what Gingrich said yesterday.
Trump's job is, frankly, to quit screwing up, get the election down to 3 or 4 big issues, all of which come down to a single concept: enough.
Help Newt Gingrich, or does this hurt his chances by saying that Donald Trump has to quit screwing it up?
Well, I think, look, what you have with Newt Gingrich is someone who tells it like it is, and that's never changed. Again, you've got a person there who has extensive Washington, D.C. experience. He's been known to be able to be bipartisan and work across party lines. You saw what Joe Biden said about Speaker Gingrich yesterday. You know, somebody who can clearly get things done in Washington. He was the last Speaker of the House to balance the budget, something that's very important to Mr. Trump. And as you look at the debt crisis that we currently have, you want an executive who can have a priority of balancing the budget.
You say a lot of this has to do with the comfort level of Donald Trump, and clearly someone who is critical of him, that would certainly speak to that. Is that something that Donald Trump is receptive to, or is that something that he would say, hey, if you have an issue, call me up privately and don't be airing this in public? Does that rub Donald Trump in a way that would make him say, maybe this isn't the guy for me?
No, I don't think so. I think Mr. Trump is very open to getting all of the opinions available to him. And look, you know, what he wants and what he has said he wants is someone who can help him accomplish his legislative agenda. It's going to be very important as the chief executive of our country to make sure that he's cutting taxes, he's reducing our national debt, he's making sure our military is strong, and having someone who has those relationships in Washington is going to be a critical component of his administration. Newt Gingrich is one of those people. Chris Christie is one of those people. Governor Pence is one of those people. Jeff Sessions is another option. All of those people have extensive relationships in Washington, D.C. with members of Congress and the U.S. Senate and could serve Mr. Trump very, very well should he choose one of them.
He has said that he is planning to announce the running mate at the convention, but then this week he began to suggest this could come sooner, maybe as early as this week. Is that an indication that his campaign feels like it needs a push of momentum, that maybe there's been a halt and he needs a jolt?
No, I don't think so at all. Look, I think if you look at the poll that was released yesterday from Gravis, it's a 2-point race right now. It's 50 to 48. It's clearly within the margin. You know, the vice presidential selection is not something traditionally that voters are voting for. But what you have is finding the right person with the right temperament to be a good partner with Mr. Trump so that the legislative agenda can be accomplished. And look, you know, the election is very fluid right now. Donald Trump is going to do very well in these battleground states, and picking someone like a Mike Pence or Chris Christie that could help in those battleground states is going to be very important to him.
Corey, the big news this weekend, Hillary Clinton meeting with the FBI. 3.5 hours she was meeting with them yesterday. And sources tell CNN that this investigation could wrap up before the conventions. And if she is cleared of wrongdoing by the Justice Department, as we expect, that short of her basically making some sort of mistake in her interview yesterday is what is going to happen, will that deprive Donald Trump of a key political weapon?
No, because I think what you have is the American public is so frustrated right now that Hillary Clinton has been under investigation from the FBI, from as many as 150 agents for a long time. The reason she went in to testify and to talk to them is because she didn't want to be subpoenaed. And the fact that Bill Clinton met with the Attorney General last week to supposedly talk about golf and grandchildren is another indication that this is a very serious investigation. I don't know if Loretta Lynch is going to recuse herself, which she should do, but Director Comey is somebody who has the highest integrity, and I think he's going to make the right decision that clearly Hillary Clinton has violated the rules of our government and should be prosecuted for this violation. I think that's what the recommendation is going to come down to from the FBI.
There was another controversy yesterday stirred by Donald Trump. I want you to look at this graphic of one of his tweets. I'm sure that you have seen this, but this is an image of Hillary Clinton alongside $100 bills and then a star that is the shape of the Star of David. It bears the words, "most corrupt candidate ever." 2 hours later, Donald Trump deleted that tweet. He tweeted out a new one without that Star of David, and you can see there was a lot of criticism over this, including from conservative blogger Eric Erickson. Obviously has had issues with Donald Trump. He said a Star of David, a pile of cash, and suggestions of corruption. Donald Trump again plays to the white supremacists. This was a big unforced error. Why does this keep happening?
Look, Eric Erickson is a person who has his own agenda. He's part of the Never Trump movement. He's upset that he hasn't been part of a winning campaign in a long time. And look, a tweet is a simple tweet, and the bottom line is you can read into things that aren't there. You know, this is a simple star, and to make an accusation.
Wait.
Here's what I'm saying. Eric Erickson is part of the Never Trump movement.
You're saying that that is a simple star. A simple star that you would expect, you know, like a star that you would give a child, a sticker, the star that would be used in things would have 5 points, not 6. You're saying that people are reading too much into this. It's the same
star that sheriff's departments across the country use all over the place to represent law enforcement. And to read into something that isn't there is you know what, I think, again, that's the mainstream media trying to attack Donald Trump for something that really isn't there. So they put a new tweet up with the circle. The message is the same. Let's look at the message. The message is that Hillary Clinton is corrupt and that the FBI is investigating the leading Democrat frontrunner.
And why did they pull it and then send out the new tweet with, instead of that star, and it wasn't a 5-point star, it was a circle the next time they did it? He did it the next time he did it.
The bottom line is, again, the bottom line, this is political correctness run amok. If this would have been a star next to Hillary Clinton and didn't have the cash behind it, no one would be questioning this. This is the mainstream media trying to read into something. And here's the thing. You have to remember where the sources are coming from. Eric Erickson is a person who's part of the Never Trump movement. He has been against Trump from day one, and that's okay, and he's entitled to do that. But at the end of the day, the message is very clear. Hillary Clinton is under investigation from the FBI. She went in this weekend for a 3.5-hour interview because she didn't want to be subpoenaed, and her husband is trying to intervene in this case by meeting with the Attorney General, not to talk about golf and to talk about grandchildren. That conversation doesn't take 30 minutes. The real question is the FBI going to make the right recommendation? Because if it were you or I or anyone else in the American public, we'd be indicted by now. And that's what should happen if that's what the facts of the case bear. And if that is the case, then Loretta Lynch should clearly either recuse herself or agree right now to accept the recommendation of the FBI, not saying that she will take those into account.
Corey Lewandowski, thank you, former campaign manager to Donald Trump.